Welcome to the Accessible Learning Experience, where we help you turn learning barriers into learning opportunities. One of our goals with this podcast is to share the lived experience of learners who use and have benefited from the provision of accessible educational materials and technology. In that spirit, this month we are lucky to have Connor Joyce on the podcast. Connor is a student at Gettysburg College who's double majoring in emerging threats in national security and political science, and also minoring in history. In 2018, he was awarded the first copy of Pennsylvania House Resolution Bill number 1044, which designated October as Dyslexia Awareness Day in the Commonwealth. And in 2021, he received the Pennsylvania Governor's Civic Engagement Award for his work in the community. Here's a conversation between our own Kelly Suding and Connor.
Hey, Connor, I am so grateful that you are one of our guests on our podcast. Would you please introduce yourself and perhaps share a little bit about your own accessibility story?
All right. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm Connor Joyce. I first was diagnosed with dyslexia from an early age, first grade. Self-diagnosed. A lot of my teachers back then thought that something was a little iffy with me when it came to reading, and I couldn't exactly place what it was, but everyone insisted that it was fine and that it was a later problem, which seems to be a common thread. But I kept on pushing for it, and I kept on pestering my mom about it. My mom finally took it to my principal, and eventually I was diagnosed in the first grade with dyslexia. So that was my, for lack of a better term, origin story of dyslexia. As I trickled on throughout my education in elementary, middle, and high school, I developed better and better with reading skills. I still had issues and still to this day have issues with things like rocket math and whatnot. So that's always a pain, and I don't think that's ever going to go away. But it is what it is. You make the most of what you can. So as time went on, around the fifth grade, I realized that technology was a good and helpful thing to use. I had advice from a couple of very important people, my former history teacher, who became now my principal in high school. And then I also have a tutor, Miss Renee, and they insisted that accessible technology was the way to go, coupled with my mom's advice and her connections and whatnot. And so I started using accessible technology. Read and Write Gold proved fundamental in this, along with Bookshare and a couple other different audiobook programs. And so nowadays, Read and Write Gold is now free to get. Back when I got it, it was not free to get, and it cost an arm and a leg. So we ended up going to a local school that was in the generic area of where I'm from in Lancaster, that is called the Janus School for Technology. I went there, and they were generous enough to give me this program for free that at the time cost lots of money, because I don't come from a well-off financial family, of lower middle class, so we couldn't afford that. And so when I did get to have this program, it really helped. Adobe Acrobat, also very helpful at translating words and from Word documents to PDFs and whatnot, and vice versa. So then as I continue to go through, you stumble across bumps and everything as you go through your education system. I had a couple interesting moments and interesting teachers, but I have a couple of really, really helpful ones that really helped me along the way. Again, that history teacher, Miss Lindsay Bowman. I had a principal in middle school, John Bennett, who was really, really helpful. He specialized in dysgraphia, and now he teaches at a school, I think in Nevada, but he teaches in dysgraphia and introduced me to some other new programs, and he always actually helped me with my math homework because I stink at math, and I still do to this day. These teachers helped me understand different perspectives on how I should learn, kind of refine a teaching style that worked for me. And so that was really, really helpful. That, coupled with my parents always being supportive and my grandparents as well, kind of helped me excel to the point where I reached the seventh grade, and I went from, oh boy, this is not going to turn out well, to C student, like I'm just barely hanging on. Like I felt like, why is this information not getting to me? I can talk about it fine, but I can't actually convey this information on a test, a quiz, a paper. But then seventh grade turned around, and that was like the miracle year in my mind, because everything started to change for the better. I realized that there are certain things that I could do for myself that were even outside of academics that were helpful. I never used to be involved in sports, for example. And I'm a tall person. I was always been tall. And my school headmaster was very, very anti, we'll say, educational experiences when it comes to like people with disabilities. And same with the principal at that time. And both of them didn't quite get dyslexia. When would I get over it? When would it end? Things like that. You need to just get over it. stop being a baby. Things like that is what I was told. But since I'm tall, I went to a private school that I really couldn't afford to go to, but my dad was the chef, so I got a faculty discount and was able to go there. And so I played basketball, and I became the team captain in my first year. And then in high school, I was a varsity basketball player, and suddenly I was getting attention with teachers and things that I never got before. So there's outside ways to help with that experience, and it's very sad that that's the case. It should not be the case, but unfortunately where I came from, that was the case. And so I had to analyze the different avenues that I could take to better my education that way too. But then as high school eventually came around, things really picked up with me. I took Spanish, and that was my only downside. I was there in the morning when my dad got there at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning for school, and I would stay there after basketball practice until 9, 10 o'clock at night. And in between, I'd be studying with my Professor Luckenball. I called him a professor, even though he wasn't one, but to me, he was, because he was that into helping me. I got out of there with a D, the only D in my life, but Spanish and me don't mix well. You just got to keep on pushing and get through it. But eventually I was able to test out of it, and I never had to look at Spanish again. And the rest of my high school, I was able to just constantly build, and I got straight A's throughout the rest of it, because I was able to narrow down, focus, and use these strategies that people like John Bennett from my middle school. Now, then my principal, Miss Lindsay Bowman, my helpful tutor, who still to this day looks over my papers and just looked over one yesterday, my historical methods class, Renee Wessner, all helped me kind of forge through this system, and then things kind of took off. And then eventually in high school, was able to do things like be elected to student government as vice president, class representative, things like that. I got into a really, really good college. It's kind of like the Johns Hopkins of history, and that's Gettysburg College. Now I kind of look back on it in high school and middle school and elementary school, and I think about all these bumps and these bruises and these hiccups that seem like they never would end. But they did, and it's just a matter of keep on pushing and finding the right person to talk to, keep on knocking on those doors, because eventually one of them's going to open. And it seems pesky to, even today, you take that mindset and people think it's just annoying, but you keep on knocking and eventually you're going to get in somewhere. And so when I got to Gettysburg, I met more people who were very helpful with this. I've been really, really lucky to find really good advisors at Gettysburg. I have a professor who helped me just with history in my first year, and then ended up being my advisor with the National Park Service, as well as a person who helped me design my own major in national security, and that's Professor Peter Carmichael. They were always just able to help me weed out things, advice on how to deal with certain professors who are definitely older and are tenured and maybe not care as much as they should when it comes to like how you deal with an accessible person who's trying to get information just in a slightly different way than everyone else. But just kind of work my way around that sort of stuff. And that kind of brought me to today. So,
Connor, thanks so much for sharing that and being so transparent in your accessibility journey thus far. It certainly sounds like you've had some solid supports through this journey, not only from your family, but very specific educators, and I'm sure that you're really grateful for that as well. You mentioned that when you recognized that reading was difficult for you, that your teachers thought maybe it was a later problem. Well, some of us refer to that as wait and see. We want to wait and see if our students will catch up next year. And then by that time, you've not been able to engage in the content, and then you may be getting further behind. So what barriers have you faced, Connor, when perhaps the instruction or the content that's given to you is not accessible for the technology that you need to use in order for you to be successful in your learning? And how have you navigated through those, and how are you still navigating?
As you go through education, there's two different systems of barriers, I'll say. In college, it's definitely easier than when I was going elementary, middle, and high school, mostly middle and high school. But there's different barriers, and some of them are the same. In middle school and high school and in college, it's mostly there's professor barriers / teacher barriers. You find the great teachers, the ones that I listed as my mentors and people who have stuck through or I still talk to this day, those people were the ones that were flexible and that kind of became like my champion almost. Like they were my elementary school heroes. Like how can I emulate? How can I do things? Because they were always able to help me and even be an advocate with other professors. But then there's other professors who use certain things, and being that I was the first person for a lot of things in my middle and high school, I was the first person to come from the economic really field that I was coming from. Faculty kid doesn't really happen, especially when he's the cook at the school. Dyslexia, like these things, and I'm a first generation college student, like these things are just things that are barriers that are naturally there, but then you overlay that with somebody who's like unwilling to help you just because they don't want to give you documents, because why can't you do it like other people? There's a fundamental misunderstanding within some parts of the education system that just because you're not missing an arm or you're having some sort of finger issue, and just because I can't see it, it doesn't exist to them. But it actually does exist, but you just can't see it. So people like to take things of what they can see, not use their minds and imagine and believe. So there's definitely that problem. There's problems where professors and teachers just won't want to talk to you because it's just you're a problem. It's just pest and a nuisance almost because it's just different from what they're used to, not because you're an actual pest or a problem. People fundamentally do not like change, and when you present something different that somebody's been doing for many, many years, that they went to school for and learned certain ways, then it's different. And so there was that problem. And then there's also a problem of the textbooks, as you mentioned. The textbook problem at Gettysburg College is very, very small compared to what it was for me in middle and high school. Middle and high school, I would have to use a learning ally. It was for dyslexia and other different types of neurological things. You can get this program and use it. And it's very, very helpful. And so I would use that for this, for listening to my audiobooks. And the ones that wouldn't cover that, my mom would always be reading it to me. So I'd be sitting there and I would be getting story time with my mom on science. And it wasn't the most fun thing in the world, I must admit. There were times that I was really cranky and I was like, why am I learning science still? I don't want to hear my mom talking to me about science. But she would read the textbook. And so that would trigger ways for me to get the information in different ways, because sometimes you're not going to be provided with all the things you need and you just kind of have to make do. And so that's definitely a hiccup that was given at the high school. And the documents for tests and quizzes were also very interesting because for me, I would get it on my laptop and I had to establish a whole system, which is a very simple system, I might add, but to them it was new, so it was complicated. People don't like change. And so I would ask them to send me something in a PDF or a Word document. And Miss Bowman, being the tech guru, everything's PowerPoint slides from Miss Bowman, the history teacher I was talking about who became the principal. And so everything was great. And she became just kind of the standard for me because she would always have everything online. She could send it to me, read and write gold. I could highlight the word. I could hit play and you read it to me. And then I could just bold my answer if it's multiple choice or type it in there if it's not. If it's other teachers, I had an English teacher who did not like doing that, right? Like I had to physically sit there and she watched me because she was afraid of cheating. I had people that would refuse to do that. So every class became a battlefield almost when it came to this. There were some classes that were easy and great. History of Miss Bowman was one of them. Other classes, English and science, sometimes not always. And so when you take that and you multiply it to standards, where I go to college now, it's much easier because there's rules and there's regulations that they have to follow and there's mandates. In high school, when it's a private school, there's a different set of rules. It's a different ballgame. When you go to Gettysburg or a different college, there's a standard that they have there that you have an agreement with the college that says they have to do things whatever fits your needs that you establish when you're first going into college, and you have to renew it every year just to make sure everything's good. And that's not a hard problem to renew it, but sometimes professors, when you send them these documents that says the Gettysburg College allows me to do this, and you send them the document, they just assume that it's just one of the run-of-the-mill things like, okay, you get time and a half, and that's it. But they don't actually read it. There's value to being in a certain field so long because you have practical experience, but not everyone's experience is the same way. And so when you're going through the different professors, sometimes you'll reach professors who don't read your stuff, and you find out halfway through the semester when you're like, okay, it's time for my midterm, and you did get this sent to me online because you don't do quizzes or anything. So I really haven't had this problem with you yet because it hasn't ever arose. And suddenly it's time for a midterm and they're looking at you like you have 4 heads and it becomes a thing. And so then you have to take it to the accessibility office and it becomes a thing. And the professor doesn't want to make you redo the exam, and it shouldn't have been done like this in the first place. And then it becomes a whole issue. I actually had an issue in one of my classes. A tenured history professor had some beef with me when it came to this, and made an accusation that I was cheating. And so I took it to the academic board, and they quickly determined that, no, that's not how that works. Just because I'm using my laptop doesn't mean I'm cheating. The professor changed his mind the next day and determined somebody else was cheating in the class, but he just automatically assumed it was me because I had my laptop open. Now, it turns out that nobody was cheating in the class, and the professor was just paranoid because nobody actually was found to be cheating. But the merit still remains is that sometimes when you go through this process, you make unfortunate enemies out of people that you don't want to be enemies with, just because you're just trying to get through everything like that, but they don't understand. So I like to think of the good in people, and so I always go in optimistically, thinking, okay, there's going to be a good semester. They read the stuff, but sometimes down the line you find out that they haven't, and then it becomes an issue and a bump on the road.
Well, I have to say, I appreciate your positive approach as you've been conquering all of these barriers within your own education. So, Connor, you mentioned one of your professors thought that you were cheating, when in fact you were just using your assistive technology accommodations to be able to access and respond to the content. And we do hear that a lot. But we also know that lack of knowledge does not mean lack of intelligence. And so it is crucial for individuals like you who really rely on that accessibility piece to be able to engage, interact, and decode and really be able to respond because you've been able to gain that knowledge. So Connor, as a current student who really relies on those accessible materials and technologies to be able to independently access your own education, what advice would you give educators to ensure that what they are giving their students is accessible to them based on their own needs or preferences?
I would say that the first thing you need to do, and one of the things that actually I worked best in college, was I had a really great professor my freshman year. His name was Chuck Rosenberg. He worked for the FBI, was chief of staff under James Comey. Like, he was a very, very intelligent person. But he, the first day I had class, did something remarkable that I'd never seen. Normally it's like a silly how do you get to know people thing, and everyone dreads it. Well, he went around and he made everyone move their desks because everyone had individual desks that were on wheels. He made everyone move their desks around the room in a horseshoe sort of style. And he came to everyone individually and he said, "Hello, my name's Chuck Rosenberg. What's your name?" And he talked to him for about 5 minutes. It took the entire period. It was a 3-hour-long class. It sounds like it was miserable. It was really fun. It was on national security, so it was my ball game. And so he went around to each person and he talked to him. And then he was just a normal guy, right? Like, to me, when you're a kid in high school and middle school, I remember this feeling that these teachers are, oh my gosh, it's scary, right? Like, you're but a middle school student. And so when I got to college, it was kind of the same feeling. Like, this is the chief of staff of the FBI, and he's teaching my class, and I'm a freshman, and this is a 300 level class. I mean, I know that apparently I'm allowed to be in this class because for whatever reason they deem me smart enough to be in this class, but still, it's one of those things that it's kind of like you feel like you're clowning Mount Olympus, and that's Zeus. And so you don't feel right. And when he went around to each student individually, he made you feel like you were on the same level, like he's approachable. And so being approachable, I thought, was key. And if I had to do it over again, I see in my mind that people like Miss Bowman, again, most influential teacher probably in my entire middle high school, did similar things that made her very approachable, and that was probably why she became one of my closest mentors. And then coupling with that, I would say that there are different things for different people that learn differently. Like, for me, one of the tips and tricks that I would have just for anybody is that people say that you're a visual learner, you're an audio learner. They like to put you in boxes. But what I found out is that nobody really is a box. People are hybrid boxes. People are half and half. So I like to see my books. I like to read them with my ears. But when I'm memorizing information, I find that doing something helps me do it. Like, it engages the physical part. So it sounds silly, but I would sit there in a spinny chair and I would spin, and my mom would say spelling words to me, and I would almost sing it, like, because I would spell it out in a sing-song manner. And I would memorize things like terms and flashcards and things like this that everyone else would just flip over, and teachers would be like, "Why can't you do that?" Well, I would spin and I would learn them differently. So in class, I would just kind of sit there because, I didn't want to look like a fool spinning in my chair by myself randomly in the middle of class. So of course I would do it later when nobody else was around. I found that I wasn't learning the same way as everyone else, but no teacher ever thought to ask me why. And so if you notice something, and I know it can be hard because people put on, different layers, they make it hard sometimes to see when, they're embarrassed or it's hard or they don't fit in like everyone else. And I'm sure I did that too. I would just make sure to ask people with like check-ins and things like that. Like, once you make yourself approachable as an educator, not to just leave it at that, to always check up on, and not necessarily like a quarterly check on, but like periodically, like every 2 weeks. If you notice, like, maybe some kids always towards the bottom of the rankings in your class quizzes that you say, okay, well, Bobby, Sue, and Mary are all at the top of the class, but Susie over there is towards the bottom. Well, what's up with Susie? There's a reason that Susie's, quote, underperforming by your metric. I mean, tests are not a good metric of people's education, but, that's how it does in the education system. But so by that metric, Susie's underperforming. Why is she underperforming? To do checkups, because then you get to find out these things, right? Like my elementary school teacher in first grade, Miss Robin Cutshaw, she noticed that I wasn't doing well with spelling words. And that was one of the things that I'm telling my mom, that something's wrong with me and that I'm having some sort of reading issue. My teacher says to my mom, hey, he's not doing well with spelling. And she says, that might be dyslexia or some variant of it. And so it was interesting when it came to that, because that's, a teacher observed this variable that was an anomaly compared to the rest of the class. And then from there, you got a base point where the teacher or the professor is collaborating what they've observed, because they're being studious to their students. They're not just caring about if they're doing well in their grades and whatnot. They're caring about them as a person, which is how I think it should be in every profession, not just education, but especially education, because as an educator, you're a role model. You're a foundation to everything that's to come.
I love that. So yes, I think sometimes a missing piece can be that relationship building part, especially when you get up into the higher grades, right? So getting to know your students is crucial. And I loved how you just talked about not keeping everyone in a box. So we have to also consider that learner variability as well. And student voice, right? Just asking the student questions like, how do you feel like you learn best? And like really getting that student feedback. And I can see clearly that was a game changer for you. Connor, again, I'm so grateful that you're here. I have no doubt that as you move forward, that you will definitely model a way to self-advocate for not only yourself, but for others when it comes to the accommodations that they need. If someone wanted to contact you, what is the best way for someone to reach you?
The best way to find me would be through LinkedIn. You just type in Connor Joyce, CONNOR space JOYCE, and my email is attached to that. You can send me a message on it. There's different ways to communicate with me on there. So that would be the best way to kind of facilitate a conversation.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Accessible Learning Experience, brought to you by the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials at CAST. You can find us on the web at aem.cast.org. There you'll find show notes with links to all of the resources mentioned on each episode. Thanks again for listening, and remember, accessibility is everyone's responsibility. The contents of this podcast were developed under a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Department of Education. However, those contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the U.S. Department of Education, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government.